What if we told you the struggles faced by black people in America today have roots tracing back to the very day they were freed from slavery? What if we suggested that Abraham Lincoln, the president who signed the famous Emancipation Proclamation, may not have done so willingly? And what if we told you the Emancipation Proclamation itself hid secrets that continue to affect black Americans even today? On January 1, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. This historic moment is often seen as the definitive end of slavery in the United States. But the reality was far more complicated. For generations, black men and women had lived and worked on Southern plantations, enduring unimaginable hardship under the oppressive system of slavery. Could a single executive order from the president truly set them free, or were their chains more deeply embedded in the social and economic fabric of the nation? Many believed that when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, enslaved people would simply walk away from the fields and abandon the tools of their labor. But this overlooks the harsh truth. The system that enslaved them didn't simply vanish with a stroke of the pen. The real impact of freedom was not so clear-cut. When Lincoln signed the proclamation, the black slaves were freed in name only, not in practice. The lack of resources, the absence of land, and the absence of a stable support system for these newly freed individuals left them in a precarious position. For many, the promise of freedom was a distant, almost unfathomable idea. To understand the depth of this issue, imagine a hot summer day on a vast plantation. The air is thick with humidity, making it difficult to breathe. Black men, women, and children toil under the blistering sun, their hands raw and their backs bent from years of labor. Every crack of a whip serves as a reminder of their status, subhuman, expendable. They labor not because they want to, but because they are conditioned to obey. Freedom is a concept that most of them can hardly grasp. The children grow up on these plantations, never knowing what it means to play or dream. They are taught only one thing: to work without rest, without reward. The idea of freedom is a distant, abstract concept, something they may have heard about but never expected to experience. When the news of the Emancipation Proclamation spreads through the fields, a murmur of disbelief passes through the workers. Could it be true? After centuries of bondage, could they finally be free? Yet the reality of freedom is not what they imagined. It is not the immediate end of suffering, but rather the beginning of a new kind of struggle, one that many of them were not prepared for. The path to emancipation was not a simple one. As the Civil War raged on, abolitionists, led by figures like Horace Greeley, were pushing for a more aggressive stance on ending slavery. The war had dragged on for years, and many in the Union began to believe that the conflict could not be won without addressing the root cause of the South's economy: slavery. However, Lincoln, ever the cautious politician, did not immediately act on this pressure. He understood the importance of maintaining the support of the border states, which were slave states that had remained loyal to the Union. The war was not just about ending slavery, but about preserving the Union, and Lincoln was carefully balancing these conflicting priorities. It wasn't until September 1862 that Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that slaves in Confederate states would be freed as of January 1, 1863, unless the Confederacy rejoined the Union. But this executive order was not the radical step many imagined. It was more of a strategic move, aimed at weakening the South by depriving them of their labor force, while preserving the Union's fragile alliances. This was not a declaration of universal freedom, but a calculated political maneuver. Lincoln understood that abolition, though morally necessary, was secondary to his primary goal: the preservation of the Union. Even as the proclamation was signed, many Southern plantation owners resisted the change. In remote areas, they kept the news of freedom from their slaves, hoping the war would end in their favor. It wasn't until Union forces moved in that these plantation owners reluctantly informed their slaves that they were free. In Kentucky, Charles Hayes, a plantation owner, kept his slaves in the dark about their freedom for days, and it wasn't until Union forces were on their way to arrest him that he told them. For many, this moment was bittersweet. Their long-awaited freedom had come, but with it, a world of uncertainty and fear. For many former slaves, the initial joy of freedom quickly gave way to fear and uncertainty. What did freedom mean without the means to survive? Without food, shelter, or education, many were forced to return to the only life they knew: working the same land, but now as paid laborers. Booker T. Washington, who was born into slavery, recalled the celebrations that followed the news of emancipation. But he also wrote about the fear that came afterward. Freedom was not as simple as walking away from the plantation. It was an overwhelming, life-altering decision that many were not prepared to face. For older slaves, the decision was even more difficult. Years of hard labor had taken a toll on their bodies, leaving them physically incapable of building a new life. The outside world was hostile, and many chose to stay on the plantations because it was safer, easier, and more certain than the unknown future. Some former slave owners attempted to negotiate new contracts with their former slaves, offering them wages in exchange for continuing to work the land. These contracts, however, were often exploitative and designed to maintain the economic dependency of the former slaves. The illusion of freedom was presented to them, but the reality was that these new freed laborers were still bound by economic necessity. The idea of true independence was out of reach for many, as they had no land, no resources, and no support system. Given these circumstances, the question remains, why didn't all slaves leave their plantations as soon as they were freed? The truth is, leaving wasn't always an option. Many former slaves had no money, no education, and no way to support themselves. They were not only physically enslaved but also economically bound to the system that had oppressed them for so long. The world outside the plantation was hostile, and systemic racism and discrimination made it nearly impossible for Black Americans to build new lives. For many, staying was not a choice but a survival strategy. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation, the legacy of slavery did not end. The mechanisms of oppression remained in place, ensuring that Black people were still subjugated by poverty, racism, and social inequality. The chains of slavery may have been broken, but the road to true freedom was long and fraught with challenges. The question remains, did Lincoln know that Black people would continue to struggle even after emancipation? Did he understand that freeing the slaves was not enough? What could the government have done to support these newly freed people and help them build a life outside of slavery? The present condition of Black Americans is deeply rooted in the time when slaves were freed, but not in the true sense. We need to acknowledge that freedom, while legally granted, did not translate into equal opportunity. What are your thoughts on the legacy of emancipation? Do you think the government could have done more to help the newly freed slaves? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more videos like this one. We appreciate your support. The question remains, did Lincoln know that Black people would continue to struggle even after emancipation? Did he understand that freeing the slaves was not enough? What could the government have done to support these newly freed people and help them build a life outside of slavery? The present condition of Black Americans is deeply rooted in the time when slaves were freed, but not in the true sense. We need to acknowledge that freedom, while legally granted, did not translate into equal opportunity.